and thanks for joining us tonight. It's nice to have a bunch of people along after a little snowy morning here in Maine. We're going to talk a little bit about Maine's moose, and at the end, we'll take some questions. Be happy to answer anything I can, but we'll talk a little bit about some moose biology. We'll talk a little bit about how we manage moose here in Maine. And thanks for joining us tonight. Of course, we'll talk about winter ticks after a little snowy morning here. And we'll also talk a little bit more about some other management things that are coming down the road here in the next year. So I first want to just start by saying that Maine Department of Fish and Wildlife's mission is really to protect and manage all wildlife in the state of Maine. And for somebody like me who just deals with moose, I talk specifically to the moose population in Maine. We also have a mission to promote Maine's outdoor heritage and certainly safely connect people with nature through responsible recreation, sport, and science. Moose are a public resource. They're appreciated in so many ways. Certainly people, whether they've seen moose in the woods or not, really appreciate the aesthetic quality of being able to view moose and see moose. It's very important culturally to many people. Recreationally, it's important. Economically, it's important. And certainly as part of the ecosystem in Maine, moose are a very important player. And of course, the Department of Fish and Wildlife has to balance the interest of all Mainers. It's great to see moose. We love to see moose. We certainly don't like to see moose on the highway. But we have to take in the various views that Mainers have and hold across the spectrum. So Maine is moose country. People who are not familiar with Maine or from other places would be probably very surprised to realize that, half of the state has some pretty prime moose habitat. If you look at this picture here, this on the left-hand side shows what I call the core range. These numbers here are some of our management districts.
Lee, we can't see your picture at the moment. I'm sorry. There seems to be a technical difficulty.
Okay. Can you see any of the pictures?
Let's see here. Try again now. Sorry, guys.
Can you see that picture?
No. Can you try sharing one more time? I don't know what happened there.
All right.
Sorry, everybody.
Can we see that picture?
We can. Thank you, Lee.
So I'm wondering if anybody saw the previous pictures. Let's start back at least to see these beautiful photos here of moose, that's for sure.
Thank you, Lee.
Yep. So as I talked about our department's mission and certainly to protect and manage moose. And I mentioned the public resource aspect that moose are appreciated in a diverse number of ways. And also that the department, and part of my job is to balance the interest of all Mainers, whether that's talking about wildlife viewing or moose hunting or dealing with problems like moose in the middle of I-95. But Maine is moose country. And this picture here that hopefully we all see now, I was showing on the left side is several of our management districts that make up our core range. On the right side, you see all this green on the northern part of the state. This is our commercial forest lands. And most of these are unorganized territories that produce a lot of good moose habitat and moose food. And that's where the majority of our moose live and breathe. And so why is Maine such a good place for moose? Well, let's back up a little bit. Moose have a diet of woody browse, and a moose needs to eat a lot of food. As you can imagine, if you're a 400-pound calf this time of year, or an 800-pound cow, or even a 1,000-pound bull, in order to sustain that body weight, especially on plant material, you have to eat a ton of food on a regular basis. Moose are essentially generalists. As many of you know, they eat shrubs. They take bark off of small trees. They eat the leaves off of trees. They eat the buds off of trees. They eat the woody tips. And moose are really adept at getting at these shrubs. They actually have a prehensile lip and tongue, so they can really manipulate their muzzle very well to get in and feed effectively and efficiently. Of course, a moose is a ruminant, and it's a member of the deer family. One of those great trivia questions. There's 4 members of the deer family: deer, moose, elk, and caribou. And of course, moose is the largest of all of that. It's nice when you live in the woods and you're the largest animal around, because if anything wants to come after you and try to eat you, size is important. And a big bull moose or a nice sized cow moose, just by its sheer size, has the ability to protect itself and has a low risk of predation because of that. But also, if you're a moose and you have nice long legs like they do in the state of Maine with deep snow, you can travel through deep snow well. And if there's any kind of sign of danger, like many people have run into a moose in the woods, they can take off pretty darn fast to get away from whatever they need to get away from. But compared to smaller animals, moose have fairly low energy requirements, and they don't have to necessarily eat high quality food. If you looked at a moose and compared it to a deer, for instance, which is probably a quarter of the size of a moose, a deer needs to eat higher quality food. But you know, especially in wintertime, moose can eat lower quality food, but they need an abundance of that food. And again, this goes back to the fact that in my previous slides there, Maine has 16,000 square miles of commercial forest lands that provides an abundance of food. And that's why that core range is able to sustain a lot of moose. So again, moose live in areas where there's abundant woody browse around, and that becomes very important in winter, especially when you start, not in quite a winter like this, but in a typical Maine winter, when you start to get 2, 3, 4 feet of snow piled up, you need to be able to move around to access food. So when winter goes away and spring starts to green up, it becomes a better time for all critters, because there's green vegetation out there that have carbohydrates and protein and other important minerals. And you know, people see moose in water a lot in the state of Maine, and they think a lot of that has to do with bugs and getting away from bugs. But the reality is that not only does Maine have a ton of different bodies of water, from lakes to rivers to streams to ponds and everything in between, but when a moose goes into a wet area, a wetland, there's a ton of semi-aquatic, aquatic vegetation, and vegetation along the banks of the body of water that are rich in sodium. And of course, when moose come out of the wintertime, they want to start bulking up again when the green matter is out there, and in that short growing period of time before fall comes again, and they can really recuperate and get back body fat by feeding in areas where there's rich food. And you know, bodies of water offer a great source of food and a great source of sodium that they desire so much come June. So in Maine, as many people who are listening know, you know, way back in the 1900s there, which is not that long ago, moose kind of phased out by the 1930s. We didn't have a lot of moose back in the 30s, and we had a bunch of farmlands that were reverting back. And you know, we had a lot of wood out there, a lot of forest cover out there in the 50s and 60s. And then in the 70s, this little insect called the spruce budworm came along and wound up defoliating a lot of the northern woods. And a lot of the mature forest was starting to degrade because of that. And the commercial forestry was able to capitalize on that and remove a lot of wood. And what happens when you take down and cut a lot of trees in the woods is new growth comes up. And really, the spruce budworm was the reason behind a new forest growing up in the 70s into the 80s and creating moose food everywhere. And we really saw the expansion of moose across not only Maine, but into New Hampshire, Vermont, and all the way down to Massachusetts and Connecticut. And this is evident by the fact that in 1980, Maine opened up its moose hunt. which was last opened in the 30s. And then in 1988, New Hampshire followed suit. And then in 1992, Vermont followed suit as well. So in Maine, we have lots of food that we talked about. We also have high adult survival rates. There's not a lot of things out there that are going to take out a moose. We have lots of food, and for us, we have a very conservative moose hunt that does not impact whether moose numbers increase or decrease. Moose management today is driven by a public process, and it's been that way for several decades, but now, just like you're witnessing tonight, social media is much more widespread than it was certainly 10 years ago, if not 5 years ago. And so when in 2017, we had a new big game management plan that the department created for deer, bear, moose, and turkeys. And we hired a private consulting agency called Responsive Management to survey Mainers, because in this day and age, it's about the computer. It's not just calling people up on a phone or sending them a written survey. There's all kinds of social platforms. So we collected all this information on big game, and we found that Mainers really, number one, approve of moose hunting, and that's a good thing for managing moose, and that they see that management as us doing a pretty good job. And so the last 40 years of our moose hunt has really been a success story. Public interest remains high. We probably get 50, 60,000 people apply for moose hunt every year. But at the same time, as much as people love moose and we like to talk about moose, understanding how moose management goes is a little bit more complex, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. This is just a picture showing some of the various things we do. I'm in the corner there measuring moose during the moose hunt. We got the Maine Forest Service helicopter there because we conduct aerial surveys, and we'll talk briefly about some of the things we do to understand the dynamics of moose. One of the things I always like to say is if I woke up tomorrow morning and I was handed the job of being the moose biologist, and tomorrow was day one, and I had all of the resources in the world, what would I do and what would I want to know about moose? What are the important things? And if you look at this picture, the 4 components that I want to know about is I want to know the density of moose, which is how many moose are out there on the lands. I want to know the composition of moose, which means I want to know how many bulls and how many cows and how many calves are out there. Excuse me. I want to know something about productivity, which is how many calves are born every year. And I want to know about survival, which is, especially with cows and calves, what their survival rates are every year, how many live and how many die every year. Those are the 4 things that I want to know to guide how we manage moose for the people of Maine. And if I can know those 4 things, something about that, I'm doing pretty well to understand this animal. And so for managing moose and understanding the population, one of our primary things we do to understand abundance or density is to do aerial surveys with a helicopter. And we do this in the wintertime between December and February 15th when there's snow on the ground and when moose are really spread out in the moose woods feeding out in the open. Obviously, they use softwood cover and they can be hard to see as well. But when you're flying in a helicopter just above the treetops at about 200 feet above ground level, the view is so good that we can see white snowshoe hares running across the snow. So looking at an 800-pound brown to black moose works out pretty good. And one of the surveys we do to count moose involves us flying along transects, which are straight lines, for 25 miles. And we do that in seven different times. It takes us all day. And we count moose along those lines within a 200-foot width. And that enables us to take a statistical look at how many moose we have in a certain block that we fly. We do a second type of survey, which is a little bit more of a rodeo, so to speak, where we go and we look for moose to classify how many bulls, cows, and calves there are in a management unit. And we do this by classifying a minimum of 100 moose. Now, a few weeks ago, I was up in the northwest of Moosehead area, and we were doing a flight, and it took us 73 minutes to classify 100 moose. And in our books, that's really good. That's really fast to do 73 moose and see that they're bulls, cows, and calves in 73 minutes. The nice thing about moose is that even when the antlers start to fall off in December, drop off the bulls, you can still differentiate between a bull and a cow. All cows have a white vulva patch below their tail that you can see from a helicopter. Most bulls have a brown face that goes into black on the muzzle, so it's got a bicolor face. And most cows have a uniform brown face that you can see when you're flying in the helicopter from above. Calves, when they're with cows, behaviorally like to stick behind mom, and if they get separated from each other, the calf will run back to the cow. And of course, there's a big size difference, and a calf has a very short muzzle. So there's lots of things that we can identify, and our crew has been doing this for over a decade, so we get pretty efficient at doing this. And it's great data for us to have. We can also know something about how productive our moose are, because in these flights, we know how many calves we see per cows that we see, and we can add that up and look at that across the regions. Now, to look at productivity, one of the other things we do is we've had a study where we looked at moose, collared moose, for 7 years. And during the summertime, we'd literally walk in and track these cows for 12 weeks of the summer to see if they had a calf with them or not. And so we learn a lot about the number of calves that are on the ground with these cows. And of course, during the moose harvest in the late October season, we collect ovaries from moose, and we're able to look at the corpora lutea of the ovaries and get a good read of productivity as well. So there's multiple ways that we're able to collect scientific data to look at our moose population. And we're going to talk briefly, but a little bit more about the last 7 years, where we had a survival mortality study looking at adult cow and calves, where we collared over 600 moose over the years and followed them around with them wearing GPS units to determine annual survival, as well as to go in and look at the cause of death of these moose if one of them died. So from 2014, the winter of 2013-14 was our first year. And from 2014 to 2020, we collared over 520 moose. We've done another 130 moose in another unit since that, including this year. When we capture these moose, we would take blood from them. We would take fecals or moose pellets to look at internal parasites and do an entire health assessment at capture. With the calves that we would catch in January, these animals are really 7-8 months old in January. We would have the helicopter lift these animals up and weigh them. So we'd have an initial weight in January of these calves. And then if those animals died later, like in March and April because of winter tick, we could weigh those animals again and see what the weight loss is. So we did that for 7 years, from 2014 to 2020, in 2 different management units, one in northern Maine and one in western Maine. And the findings of that study was really that the winter tick was the primary mortality driver of young moose. And in fact, in our western study area, the mortality, the number of calves that died in the springtime, was twice the amount in the western unit. But the good news is that we had high adult survival. But of course, one of the other things that winter tick can do when it's feeding on a moose is also depress reproduction by affecting the body condition of the female cow who's pregnant in the springtime. And this picture on the right, as gross as it is one of our collared calves that died. And all of these little bumps on here, depending on how well you can see our picture, are all adult female ticks that were feeding on this moose calf. And this calf is devoid of hair because the winter tick irritates the moose so badly that it rubs off and scratches that hair off as well. And I'll talk a couple of slides about winter ticks themselves. Here is just a little famous pie chart that shows that of all the moose that died in those 7 years of our study, and that was 320 that we examined, 83% of those, and mostly calves, the cause of their death was winter tick. So 83%, the majority of these animals that was the reason why those animals had died, which is pretty astounding, because if you take away winter tick from this picture and you don't have winter ticks, you take away winter tick from Maine, you don't have all of these calves dying. You have close to that surviving. That's a tremendous thing to think about. In most of North America, I just need to mention this. Moose densities are typically pretty low. They're not like deer. If you picture deer in your back 40 acres, you can support a lot of deer. But on the same amount of ground, or you can support very few, and moose, that is. And we talked about that at the beginning of this talk, which is moose require so much more food on a daily basis that they have to live at low densities because of the amount of food that it takes for them to sustain their life. And typically, moose densities are a product of habitat quality, and we're fortunate that the forest lands provide so much. But there are very few places in North America, and we're talking about not only northern part of the United States, whether that's the Northeast, the Midwest, or the West, but also we're talking about Canadian populations of moose as well, and Alaska. But in Maine, we have areas that are so dense with moose, even in the face where we have some years with heavy winter tick losses, where we lose a bunch of calves, because of high adult survival, we still wind up in some areas, where moose are still pretty thick, and in some areas higher than 5 moose per square mile. And when you have a high density population of an animal, whether that's a moose or something else, you tend to find other things that are not so good with it, meaning high densities of animals have more disease, they get more parasites, and their productivity, how many young are born every year, gets lowered quite a bit. And in Maine, we see that quite a bit. Our twinning rates, the number of cows that have twins every year, has fallen drastically from the 1980s when moose were recolonizing Maine and moving into other parts of New England. So we have twinning rates that are really, really low. We have adult cows that breed and are successful carrying a calf to term at a later age because of the impacts of winter tick on their back and the drain of winter ticks on them. So there are effects, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So all those things I was talking about is really referred to in the scientific world as density dependence. When you have, a high density of animals that are starting to cause problems because there's so many of them. And we know in the state of Maine that our food quality and quantity remains stable, and it's not affecting our moose population. The moose have plenty of food, and we've done research to look at that. We also know that our hunting permits since 1980 have been very conservative. And even when you see increases in permits, that's not affecting whether that moose population is increasing or decreasing. What is affecting how our population increases or changes over time, and where some of our moose range is shrinking, where we had more moose in the far southerly part of the state, and where that range starts to shrink up, has to do with having a lot of winter ticks and the effect it has with losing calves in the springtime. In fact, in our study, 6 out of the 7 years in our western study area, we lost between 50 and 70% of our collared calves in March and April due to winter tick. So that's one impact directly on the calves, but also, like I mentioned before with cows, when they have the tick burden on their back, literally in the springtime when they're pregnant, they may wind up giving birth to calves that are much underweight and don't survive the first 3 weeks of life because they had all this blood being removed by the winter tick in March and April. So, things have changed quite a bit over the last 50 years. Things are always changing. But unchecked growth of moose is not a great thing either when you get these high densities. And, in the last 20 years, we've seen our winters shorten up by about 2 weeks. So we get a fall that gets extended where we have warmer weather, which is really good for ticks. And we've had a lot of moose in the last 20 years. And that's created a situation where our ticks have increased quite a bit. So we're going to talk briefly here more about the winter tick, because people have heard a lot about winter tick, but there's a bit more to that story. So if you can see in this picture here, this is a picture of my hands, my fingers there, just on a moose. And those are hundreds of winter ticks just on a small patch of moose. That's probably about a 4-inch by 4-inch piece of the back of a moose that I'm trying to count ticks on. And the winter tick is a distinct species. It's not a dog tick. It's not a deer tick. It is the winter tick, and it really thrives on moose to the tune of moose can have 50 to 90,000 ticks on one moose just during the winter time. And the winter tick is a one host, 1 year life cycle tick. So the deer ticks and the dog ticks have a 3-year life cycle where they're larvae, nymph, and adult stages, and they have to feed on 3 different types of animals to complete their life cycle. But the winter tick does all those 3 life stages on the back of one moose. So as a larvae, it crawls up on the moose in the fall, and it takes blood, and it stays on there all winter long and becomes a nymph and takes blood, and then becomes an adult and takes blood. And you can see this picture on the right. This is really pretty much the actual size if you were looking at your computer screen. And this is an engorged female winter tick full of moose blood. And that's about a mil of blood, a milliliter of blood that it takes. And if you, like I said before, a moose can have 50 to 90,000 ticks feeding on it in the springtime. These winter ticks are not an invasive species. We can document them on paper all the way back to the 1930s in Maine. Winter ticks are known from Texas to southern Canada. But in areas where they see winter ticks impacting moose, it may be that they see it in 1 year where there's a bad spring where people who spend time in the woods see and find a lot of dead moose. But nobody across the moose range has seen the impacts of consecutive years where they've found a lot of dead moose like we've seen in our research right here in Maine. And so that's been really a difficult thing to watch and investigate through our research. So why are these ticks so bad for moose? I've already talked about this, quite a bit. The thing is when those larvae climb up the vegetation in the fall in September and October and wait for something to come by, they're at the perfect height for a moose. And when a moose brushes by a tree or a shrub filled with the larval ticks, it doesn't get one tick on it, it gets thousands of ticks on it, because when that adult female has laid her eggs in the summertime, they spend the summer dormant, those eggs do, they hatch out in the fall, then all those eggs in mass climb up onto a shrub, and there'll be hundreds to thousands on a single shrub. So a moose walks by, gets the gets the ticks on him. Sorry about that. And the moose doesn't know that. So other animals like deer and snowshoe hare can walk by the same plant, same tree, same shrub, get ticks on them, but can feel those ticks on them and groom those ticks off. But the moose doesn't realize the ticks are on it until later in the winter, maybe December and January. And that's when they start to rub their hair and break their hair off and feel those ticks, feeding on them. So like I mentioned, not only do the winter ticks impact the calves because of the massive feeding and loss of blood, which creates a state of anemia for those moose calves, but when those ticks are on the adult cow in the springtime and in the late wintertime, she's depending on the fat that she accumulated in the fall to make it to the next green up period come May or June. Now in March and April, she's got ticks on her and she's got a calf fetus inside her, but there's only browse to eat out there and very little protein. There's nothing green in the woods of Maine in January, February, March. And so she's losing body condition as those ticks feed on her. And in fact, our calves, when we catch them in January at 400 pounds, they will lose over 30% of their body weight by April, just in 12 weeks, due to the fact that these ticks are on them. With the cows, they're also losing weight, but they go into winter with some fat on them, so they can take some of the brunt of those ticks. But it does wind up creating lower productivity rates for these cows. And like I mentioned before, less twins are born, and it's difficult for a newborn calf to survive. So what does this mean for a moose population? Well, it means that a population of moose can have either very little growth because there's so few calves making it, or there's some years where the moose population has a bump up and does well because the ticks weren't that bad. And then it's followed by a bad tick year where it drops off again. So the population can go up and down, or it can stagnate, or it can just start to slowly decline over time because we're not getting enough calves back into that population. And as I mentioned before, if you're a female calf and you make it through your first year to your birthday in May, you made it through, but you may be in poor condition because of the ticks. And then you have June, July, August into September to try to gain back some weight. And really, for a cow to become pregnant and ovulate, she has to gain a certain amount of weight to be able to do that. And what we're seeing is that instead of a moose getting pregnant when it's a year and a half or even 2.5, it may be 3.5 the first time it's able to carry its pregnancy through for a full course and have an actual calf. And this is all tied to body weight and being able to maintain and hang on to that weight. And it would be nice if there were no ticks that are depressing that. So what can we do about winter tick? We get these questions asked a lot. And, you know, people talk about spraying the woods where the moose live, or putting tick collars and spraying the moose. Well, here's the difficulty here, which is, you know, I give a pill to my dog once a month. My dog is in my house. I can control my dog. And I know how big my dog is, and I can weigh her whenever I want to make sure it's the right dosage. Well, we don't have that type of capability with moose. And, you know, to protect one moose from winter ticks is a noble cause, but in order to impact winter ticks and to protect the population over time, you need to impact thousands and thousands of moose. In the commercial forest lands of Maine, the 16,000 square miles are commercial forest lands owned privately. They're not owned by the state. They're not public lands. Spraying for ticks would kill every insect out there and impact water quality and everything. That's just it's really not even in the conversation. Putting tick collars on moose, well, again, a January calf is 400 pounds. We spend a week trying to capture 70 moose at quite a cost to put a GPS collar on a moose. And a tick collar is not effective on a moose, and trying to put a spray or something on moose. And the number of moose we would need to do is just, it's almost impossibility when you add everything up. People have talked about introducing guinea fowl and possums to control ticks. None of these which are native to the state, and none of these which would survive the winter when the ticks are out. And the winter tick, again, is out in September and October and quickly gets on a moose, and then it's on the moose. We do have some native birds like ravens and Canada jays that will feed on the winter ticks, but clearly they don't make any kind of a dent on all of the winter ticks that are out there on the landscape. So there's really not a practical way to deal with moose over such a large area and with the numbers that we need to try to do anything about that. But we do know that people want us to improve the health of our moose and not see moose with heavy parasite loads, whether that's internally with lungworms and tapeworms that we see very commonly, or with the winter tick on their back. And so one of the things we want to try to do is break the winter tick cycle by trying to reduce the number of moose in a given area, and to be able to measure that over time to see if we can break the tick cycle. We know that in other places where moose populations are much lower, that moose are much more productive and have more calves, and they don't have parasites like the winter tick on them, and they don't have internal parasites like lungworms when densities of moose are at much lower levels. And so one of the things that the department is talking about and proposing for this year is to have this adaptive unit hunt, which I'll mention briefly, which involves increasing the cow harvesting areas, which is really an important management tool because, you know, most Mainers agree and think moose hunting is a good thing. It's sustainable. It's very supportive. It provides people with hundreds of pounds of moose venison and quality meat. It's a hunting tradition. But in many areas of the northern part of our state, we have winter tick and we have densities that are still too high. We know that in the 7 years of our project that winter ticks are the primary driver of some of these issues that we've mentioned with calf mortality. And we also know that the public in many ways doesn't like to see increased cow permits and that they have some concerns. And we also know that when the public wants to go see moose, that they've seen less moose with the forest growing up in places. And there's challenges there. And we also know that combating ticks by reducing moose density is rather a counterintuitive thought to actually bring the moose population down to deal with the bad effects of winter tick. And so what we're doing is proposing an adaptive unit where we bring down the moose population in 6% of that big, huge core range. So just a small portion to test and measure over time. Over 5 years, if we can increase the cow harvest and reduce the moose density, can we break the tick cycle so that the calves, like this one in the right-hand corner, can survive and not be impacted by winter tick? And can we increase cow productivity by not having the winter tick? And this is a phenomenon, moose and winter tick, that has been studied for decades, and lots of sound and good science behind doing something like this. In the state of Maine, we have the ability to measure the outcome of this. And this is something that's going to be proposed. So we think that if we demonstrate through this adaptive approach, whether reducing moose densities can break the tick cycle, that that's the best and most scientific way to go. And it may work or it may not work. But in 5 years, we can measure that through doing aerial surveys. And this is a blown up picture of, I showed you before, of my hands and just the incredible amount of ticks just in a small space. This area that we're talking about, our proposal, there's a small map here. I showed you this map before. It would be in half of District 4 up here, which is north west of Baxter State Park. It just represents 6% of the core range, where we know we have issues with winter tick. In 2020, so the winter before this, we collared 60 calves in January, and by April of the year, we had lost 38% of those collared calves had died due to winter tick. This year, we collared 70 calves in that same area, and we're also watching and monitoring those moose as well to see what their survival will look like this year and look at the impact of winter tick. So I briefly was starting to mention our ability to measure and assess the situation. So every year, starting last year, like I said, we capture the calves and follow them. If the moose dies, the calf dies, we go in there and we're able to look at the tick loads and weigh the moose to see what the loss was and do a necropsy on that moose to make sure that we're checking everything out for cause of death. Of course, we collect harvest information or the moose hunt where we can get ages on animals, which gives us a lot of good data. We do winter tick counts on all the moose harvested in the October season in the fall. We also conduct aerial surveys, which we've been intensively doing, specifically these last 2 winters in this adaptive unit to assess not only how many moose are out there, but the number of cows, bulls, and calves. And we also continue to look at our annual reproduction. So the potential outcomes of our adaptive unit is that we increase the harvest as we're proposing, and it does not affect tick numbers or lower calf mortality. That's one outcome. We increase harvest and it doesn't work. The other outcome is we increase harvest and it does work, It does break the tick cycle. We see improved survival of our calves. But either way it goes, from a scientific point of view, it provides us with another management tool to maintain a healthy moose population. And this is a scenario where, as every winter goes by, every year goes by, and things continue to happen out on the landscape with ticks and things like that, you don't want to look back 10 years from now saying, wow, we should have really undertaken this study and looked at the science of this 10 years ago. So you need to act now, concerning all the things that are going on. And so that's something that'll be proposed for 2021. And really with that, I'd like to end this because we'd like to be available to take any questions about moose, whether it's about the adaptive unit or moose in general. We'd certainly be happy to take any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lee. That was great. We did get some questions in the chat, a lot of great interest in everything. And if you have more questions when this is over, you can all go to mefishwildlife.com as well. But we'll try to ask a few of your questions this evening before we finish up. So to get us started, there were some questions in regards to some moose biology. Somebody was wondering, do you know what the average amount of sodium that moose would need or can consume in a year?
Wow. I have no idea the actual amount. All I can tell you, though, is this, is that there seems to be an unending craving for sodium. And so I don't know if it has been measured. I don't think, typically with minerals, whatever that mineral is that a moose needs to sustain its body functions, it's usually a very, very tiny amount. But clearly when I've seen many instances, because I've spent a lot of time out in the moose woods, moose in salt licks that look like they're endlessly using them. But I will tell you this too. With our collared moose, following these through the years, a collared moose, we will see a moose in its small home range leave to walk 15 miles to hit a salt lick and spend a day or two at that salt lick for sodium, and then go 15 miles back to where it lives. Because salt licks aren't just everywhere on the landscape. So, before spring green up and they can get into a body of water to get a sodium enriched plants, they'll go to natural mineral licks and they'll lick salt off the road where the DOT has spread salt. And so it's not a great answer to your question as far as the actual amounts, but it's something that they clearly can't live without.
That's great. Thank you. And some also wanted to know something else about brainworm. They've heard a little bit about it, and what are the effects that has on moose?
Yeah, so brainworm is called many things. People call it meningeal worm because it gets in the meninges, which surround the brain. But basically what it is it is a parasitic worm that's inside the moose that moves through the central nervous system. And because it's moving through, it can go through the spinal cord, it can go up into the meninges. And clearly, if you have a worm, or in this case, it can be multiple worms traveling internally through your body, it can cause all kinds of neurological problems. So typically with a brainworm moose that people talk about, it'll do some really disturbing things, like it will walk in circles with its head bent in one direction, and almost like it has a stiff neck and it's being reined or pulled to one side. We find moose that have brainworm that have hind end paralysis. So they're laying down and they can't get up, and they'll be shaking. They won't have control. And of course, if a moose has any kind of paralysis and can't get up and can't move and lingers for days, as we were talking about before, a moose needs to eat a lot of food every day to keep its natural balance. Many of these moose that have meningeal worm will die from that. Or you get moose with brainworm that are very assertive, I guess is the word for it, can run at vehicles, or they're standing around in the middle of a highway and don't know what they're doing. So there's all kinds of problems. Now, that being said, moose can survive meningeal worm. So it's not always a death sentence, but other states see more brainworm than we do. When we see it because a member of the public has called up and said, I just had a moose run through and break my fence, or a moose just tried to attack my car, or some crazy thing like that. So, but mostly where we see brainworm is where moose overlap with high deer densities. Deer don't seem to be impacted by meningeal worm, but they are carriers of that parasite.
Excellent. That's a lot of good information. On that note of moose survival, someone was curious, how long is the life of bulls and cows?
Well, so we know this from, we look at the ages of moose in our harvest, and believe it or not, we have cows up to the age of 19 years old, which is pretty impressive. And we've had bulls as old as 18. Now, here's the interesting thing about this is that you think of the life of a big animal like a horse, and I guess horses can live crazy time, right? 40 years, I don't know what it is. Domestic, right? So they benefit from having medicine, and so now you're talking about a wild animal, a moose, right? That's impressive. You know what? Moose can die from bad teeth, and I'm not joking here. So as a moose lives its life, and it's using its incisors in the front. It's got no top teeth. It has a soft palate. It's taking browse and ripping that off, brings it back into its molars and chewing, grinding plant material. Well, it's going to grind other stuff as well. And moose teeth do wear down over time. And if you're an old moose and your teeth get so worn down, then you start to incur problems with being able to feed like you need to. So you can have many moose die of old age, that's for sure.
And someone was wondering, does the habitat quality help the calves combat the effects of winter tick? So would like a better habitat help them have a better chance at survival if they have winter tick for the calves?
So there's two things here that make it complicated. So when I talk about calves, I'm talking about calves usually in the middle of winter. So let's talk about both calves in the middle of winter and calves in May. So when an adult cow, like I was saying, is bred in the end of September, early October, she gets bred, she gets pregnant, and she's got food to eat for just a little bit longer, and all the fat she's ever going to have is going to be in the fall. So now she's going through December and January, and she's got ticks on her in February and March. And if she doesn't have enough fat on her, but she's still pregnant, she's got to have enough resources to feed herself, but also feed the growing calf inside her. And so what we're seeing happening is the cow's losing condition and losing weight coming into March and April and May. And then mid-May, she gives birth to a calf. Well, as depleted as she gets, more likely than not, she's still going to give birth to a calf. And instead of that calf being 35 pounds, that calf's going to be 20 pounds. And it's going to have no chance of making it, because now, not only is it small, but the cow is in a poorer state of condition, and she also has to lactate, which is a huge energetic demand. So that's really tough. So even if she's got high quality feed in the fall and she gets fattened up for the fall, it's going to depend on her tick load as well, because some moose have a ton heavy tick load, and others have a lot less. So it depends on the cow. Now, for the newborn calf who survives in May, who's born in May, and makes it through the first 3 weeks of life, because it's a dangerous time, that calf is dependent on mom's milk. So again, it goes back to how healthy mom is, because she's feeding on that milk, she or he, calf, throughout the summer until the end of summer, when it starts to feed on moose food. In fact, a moose has 4 stomachs, I mentioned in the beginning, but when it's a baby moose born in May, it only has one stomach, the abomasum, that's developed, and the abomasum can digest milk, and then the other chambers of the stomach develop fully by the end of the summer when the moose calf gets weaned onto so-called normal diet away from mother's milk. So it's kind of a cool thing that's happening there.
Oh, that's a really interesting fact there about that. There's definitely a lot of factors that affect that survival. So somebody wanted to know, have winter ticks always been in Maine? And then is it also an issue in other areas of North America as well?
Yeah, so we have it in writing that Maine game wardens and biologists were running into winter ticks back in the 1930s. It's kind of cool. We have a library in the Bangor office, and I was digging through that a few years ago and finding writings of wardens and biologists who were writing down that they were in the woods in March or April, and they came upon a dead moose, and when upon further examination, they found the winter tick. But so winter tick is known throughout Northeast, and we have big issues in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and they're seeing it as well in Quebec, the province of Quebec, in New Brunswick. It's in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and then in places that see ticks. It's weird about ticks because ticks actually need moist or humid conditions to live. I always think of them wanting dry, hot conditions, but they need moisture. And so places like the arid West, like Utah, has winter tick and problems with winter tick. Minnesota does, which is certainly a humid climate. But the Northeast has had more of a problem in consecutive years with having winter tick causing problems year after year after year. That's what we have seen. And while other jurisdictions like Isle Royale in Michigan has had, historically you could pick out a year where they had a bad winter tick year and lost a bunch of animals. They've seen that in provinces like Alberta. But very few of these places have seen it more than a year or two in a row. We saw it 6 out of 7 years in our one study area. And that 7th year was still pretty high calf mortality with winter tick.
So that being said, if somebody were to harvest a moose and they're an out-of-stater, would the ticks live and travel to the other states when they take their moose home?
So during the moose hunt, whether it's September, October, or we've had some small moose hunt in November, there are winter tick larvae on these moose hides. And they're trying to feed off that moose, but once that hide is off the moose, it really has no place to go. And I really would highly doubt at that point you have a larvae that needs to get on another live animal to fulfill the rest of its life, to get on and use its nymphal stage and other stage. And it's everybody who gets ticks on them knows it except moose. So if a non-resident takes a moose and then takes the hide or something out to another state, I would say it's an extremely low probability that I think those ticks would all die off. They're going to be falling off once the moose carcass is starting to cool down and everything. They're disappearing.
Right, it's not a good place for them to be anymore. No more resources for the ticks.
Yeah.
And so speaking of, winter ticks, I know it can be, a little confusing. We always hear so much about ticks. Is the winter tick a type of tick that's going to affect people? Is it something that people have to be worried about?
That's a great question, because we're very fortunate in the state of Maine that we have a vector-borne disease lab in Portland, Maine, that looks at ticks, all ticks, and has done all kinds of research and analysis on what those ticks carry. And we all need to be very cognizant and aware of the deer tick that many people deal with in southern Maine and coastal Maine. Even though they're in all counties, the deer tick is the real threat to humans because it carries Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, babesia, Ehrlichia. The winter tick so far is not known to carry any of these. And not only that, but the only time that people run into the winter tick is sometimes we get bird hunters, like partridge hunters in the fall, who are in the moose woods looking for birds, and they'll get what they think, some people think they're mites because they look kind of reddish brown, but they're little specks like pepper, and they hit a bush like a moose would, and they're all over the person. I've heard that some people think they get a little bit of a skin reaction to it, but for the most part, those larval ticks are trying to get off people. And as far as we know right now, conventional wisdom is that they have no disease threat to humans. And I've gotten lots of adult winter ticks on me when I'm dealing with a moose necropsy in the wintertime. And, they're pretty good size. And I've been sitting down to dinner with my wife and my daughters, and they look at me and they go, and then, yep, oh, look at that. I got a big winter tick crawling across my head. It happens, but it only happens to people who are, I guess, do what I do.
Some unique experiences getting out there for sure. So we're going to just take a couple more questions in interest of time. But again, you can always go to mefishwildlife.com to learn more information, or you can also check out our podcast, Fishing Game Changers. There is a mini series about Maine's moose, so you can listen to that anywhere you can listen to your podcast. So just a couple more questions here. So there was a question about the adaptive hunt in Zone 4, and it's how big is the population estimate up there in Zone 4, or how dense is it compared to some of the other parts of the state?
Well, it's interesting because the survey we did this winter with our helicopter, we had more than 8 moose per square mile on that western side. Last year we flew both sides, the adaptive unit side, the western side of 4. So District 4 is 2,000 square miles, and it runs from the Quebec border to the Allagash Waterway, and it runs from the Golden Road up to the Reality Road, and we split that in half. And the western side had twice the amount of moose. But even the eastern side, which in the winter 20, when we flew that, we had over 4 moose per square mile, which is pretty impressive. And this year, flying surveys this past couple of months, the winter, it's hard to keep this all in your mind, but the winter before last, so the year 2020, our moose had a good year for once in a number of years. And so we got a bump up in productivity in 2020. And we had a good spring survival in 2020. Now in 2021, which I'm trying to get used to saying, this last fall, our productivity really decreased a lot. So this is not a good, this is not going to be as good of a spring for calving. So it changes over time. But yeah, there was that part of District 4 has probably become one of our densest populations of moose now, more than other. It switches over time, where one unit gets a lot more than the other, and some of that has to do with the changes in forest practices and where they're cutting and things, but it's a lot.
It's a lot of things about moose to keep track of. This is great. So we're just going to do 2 more questions, guys. So again, you can always find us online later. There was a question about, are there any natural predators to moose in Maine?
There are no natural predators to adult moose in Maine. For our calf moose, again, the first 3 weeks of life is when they're most vulnerable. And black bears can certainly kill and take a calf. And that's really the predominant one, because you got to understand too, is that if you have a healthy cow and a healthy calf, moose are all about maternal defense. And we walk in on these moose and try to sneak up on them from the day the calf is born. And we find about half of the time you get cows that will stand and look at you with death in their eyes. And then you got another half of those moose that will take their calf and run off if the calf is able to. If an animal is compromised, like we're talking about, you have a calf that's born and it's underweight, it's probably not going to have much of a chance against, anything, let alone a black bear. But black bears are going to be the predominant predator of a calf in the first month of life.
Right. So one more question. Someone was curious about the unique large nose of the moose. Why is it like that? Someone wanted to know about the function of why the moose's nose is so big.
Well, I mean, it plays a lot of different roles, and clearly, a moose has poor vision, and having no offense, I mean, to having a really big nose, but it does not help with your straight on viewing of things. So a moose has to depend on its hearing, on its ears, which are acute, and it has to depend on its nose. But like I was saying before, a moose it all goes hand in hand. The size of a moose head, the size of a moose mouth and teeth are all designed to be able to eat and utilize coarse woody debris. So when you look at the size of a twig in wintertime that a moose is going to grab and trim off and chew, it needs to have powerful jaws, and it also has glands that secrete a lot of saliva. So a moose has a lot of drool because it's got to soak and start breaking down all that woody browse to chew it, bring it in its gut, and ruminate. So, but a moose's nose also, when they go underneath the water to feed, they can be underwater for 30 seconds, and we've watched them where all you see is the top of a moose going back and forth, and it's mowing the aquatic vegetation and rooting it up. Well, their nostrils self-seal, so water's not going up their nose. So they're underwater. They have self-sealing nostrils. They can also dive to 18 feet. So can you imagine? Picture this. This is a good last question. Go to bed tonight. Think about diving into some pond, and you're swimming down around, and all of a sudden you come face to snout with a moose who also had the same idea as you to dive down to grab some aquatic vegetation. It's pretty interesting. But also the thing with the muzzle of a moose is it can reach into a dense thing of brush and twigs and be nipping off things and feeding. But there's lots of advantages to it. A moose has a special organ, a bull does, up in its root of its mouth, so it can smell when a female is in estrus or in heat. So it can curl back its lips and really take in, because a moose, especially an eastern moose, wants to breed as many cows as he can, and he's living in a forested setting where he can't see everything. So he's got to depend on his smell to make his life good. And so a big old, and just for this person's sake, one of the nicknames of the moose is Old Bucket Nose. That's one of my favorite ones. We call them swamp donkeys, but they're also known as Old Bucket Nose.
That is a nice new nickname that I did not know before about moose. I like that.
And also among some people, especially groups that have been hunting moose back in the day, moose muzzle is considered a nice delicacy from your moose hunt. So there's a recipe for eating moose muzzle.
So many different things to do with a moose.
It's an important function.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, this has been really great, Lee. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us and sharing all this wonderful moose knowledge. We really appreciate it. And if the rest of you would like to know more about Maine's moose and moose hunting and things like that, you can visit us at mefishwildlife.com for more information. And again, I encourage you to listen to our podcast, Maine Fishing Game Changers, and there is a mini series about Maine's moose that you could listen to. So lots of great information out there. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you have a great evening. Bye-bye.